recent years has been the urban farming movement, which is the first thing that kind of gave Detroit this notion that we were going to be the post-industrial city that reinvented the nature of post-industrial cities. That there's hundreds of these cities around the globe that lost their industry and saw their population decline. And everyone's been struggling to think about how do you recover, and there were a lot of economic development tax breaks thrown at all kinds of projects. But urban farming really was the first thing that helped sort of recreate the notion of what a city is. And this is when you take vacant and abandoned urban land, often polluted, and you clean it up. And you start making it a productive landscape by growing food, or perhaps growing sunflowers, or using it to raise chickens and goats, which we see a lot of in Detroit. So I think the urban farming movement really took off about 15 years ago in Detroit, and now we probably have more than 1,000 community gardens in the city, and some of them have gotten to be quite large and are actually, even though they're nonprofit, they're commercial in nature. There's one called Recovery Park, which bought 65 acres from the city a year or two ago. And when you go to a lot of the newer restaurants in and around Detroit, you can buy a Recovery Park salad greens. And there's another one called Earthworks Urban Farms on the east side of Detroit, where they grow the food for the soup kitchen, and they serve thousands of meals a year for homeless people or hungry people with food grown a block away in Detroit. So urban farming is certainly one of the big things, and neighborhoods like Brightmoor on the northwest side, which is one of the most distressed, abandoned neighborhoods in the city, has been cleaned up a lot, and urban farming is a big part of that story. A couple of other things that have been happening. We've had a real ecological recovery of the Detroit River, which is really interesting. The Detroit River used to be as polluted as any waterway next to a major industrial site, and it's been cleaned up to the point where wildlife is returning. Bald eagles are now nesting along the Detroit River. The beaver is back. The beaver was the reason the French came here 300 some years ago to start a colony, an outpost, beaver fur trapping, and they were trapped out and disappeared from the Detroit River at least 100 years ago, and now they're back. There are several beaver lodges along the river. And then the entrepreneurial movement has flourished in Detroit and is flourishing. The maker movement, so that Detroit for the last 100 years was the site of the most gigantic corporations in the world, and entrepreneurs were not needed because you had to be a company man, a corporate man. But as corporations, the big three, the automakers, began to suffer and decline, it opened up a space for entrepreneurs to begin to flourish. And so we're seeing people do all kinds of things. Some of them are tech entrepreneurs, a lot of them are mom and pop groceries, but there's been this whole notion that Detroit's now pivoting from gargantuan corporate power structures to a much more nimble entrepreneurial-based economy. We have thousands of entrepreneurs starting little businesses, everything, phone apps and websites, and we manufacture blue jeans in Detroit, high-end blue jeans that sell for $300 a pair, and all kinds of stuff. And so the entrepreneurial movement is one of those things that gives Detroit this flavor of reinvention. So I think between the farmers and the entrepreneurs and the ecological recovery of the environment here, I think Detroit's become just a very interesting place, and really a model of how a city that was completely on its back and thought to be the global poster child for urban ruin is now really one of the more interesting cities in America.
Yeah, I was good. Was leading to one of my questions when you were talking. I was thinking, compared to other cities in the country, do you think Detroit's definitely at the top of this change, of this nexus?
I think Detroit definitely is among the leaders in this change, or this notion that we're going to recover and reinvent post-industrial cities. Detroit's not going to be what it was in 1950 with all the auto factories and all that sort of stuff, but it's going to be something new and something different and something something better. And I think people around the world recognize that because we get visitors from around the world all the time. Beginning several years ago, I noticed that Detroit was the place that was attracting urban planners and architects and artists and documentary filmmakers and academics and journalists all coming to Detroit to see what we were doing here, because this is the place that people get a sense that this is where we're going to reinvent one of these cities.
Yeah, I remember that wave of coverage about Detroit, but from my perspective lately, I haven't noticed it as much. Maybe I just am missing it. But I remember there was this huge swell of stories about people moving here and taking vacant land and growing things. Do you think that PR or the news is still getting out there like it should be, or like to the rest of the world outside of Detroit?
Yeah, I think that I still notice as much as ever, and we still get these articles about, in the New York Times, let's say, about Detroit is the next Brooklyn, or Detroit's the next Berlin, or the next recovery story. And I think we've gone very quickly from Detroit's international image of Rust Belt ruin to Detroit as the comeback city, the city that's figuring it out. Now, I think it's somewhat, I won't say it's exaggerated. I think that Detroit's a complex place, and we have a long way to go. But we are doing a lot of remarkable things here, and I think the world has taken notice.
Yeah, no, I've just got here, but from researching things and reading your amazing articles in the Detroit Free Press, there's a lot of exciting things happening here, especially when you see the vast amounts of space out there to transform, just statistically. Can you mention a few things for someone who's not a professional in urban agriculture or design or any kind of way looking to create new infrastructure for cities, but just an average person coming to Detroit? Where would you recommend, a few things where they could go to experience this sort of renaissance, like a few farms or restaurants or businesses where they could actually get a tour or meet people?
Sure. Well, at first I would go down to the Detroit River, which the riverfront for 200 years was working off an industrialized waterfront, a lot of railroad yards, a lot of factories, that kind of stuff, a lot of warehouses. We were infamous for having our cement silos on the East Riverfront, where barges would come in and drop off cement and trucks would come in and pick it up. And all that's been cleared away. And we now have what's called the Detroit Riverwalk, which is in the process of becoming this 5-mile promenade, recreational promenade, which will be a spur for economic development, new housing and new retail right alongside it. About 3 miles or so, or 3.5 miles of the Riverwalk, the promenade itself has already been completed, and people should definitely look at that. And then some of the new housing that's going to rise there is in the works. And a lot of the older buildings that survive are being converted into, from warehouses to housing. So the waterfront, I think, is definitely one of the coolest things Detroit has done, and really a model for a large-scale project like that. I think the city's Midtown district, just north of downtown, which is the Museum University District, is remarkable for the amount of recovery. Dozens of new restaurants and coffee shops and older buildings being converted to housing. So I would definitely visit the Midtown district.
That's where Recovery Park is, right?
Recovery Park's a little bit east of there. You have to. It's not walking distance from Midtown, but it's sort of slightly east of the Midtown district. And then if you could get a tour, and one sign I think of Detroit's recovery is that the tour groups are now more numerous than they used to be, and you can say, I want to have an urban agriculture tour, or I want to have an architectural tour, or whatever, or historic sites tour, and you can get around and see some of these sites like Earthworks Urban Farm or Recovery Park Urban Agriculture, or you can go out to neighborhoods like Brightmoor. I think Southwest Detroit, along what we call Verner Highway, which is the Hispanic district in Detroit, is flourishing in a way that a lot of the city is yet to accomplish, and just because of the vibrancy of the immigrant community there. And I think downtown Detroit itself is remarkably further ahead than it was even 10 years ago. It used to be one of the most abandoned downtowns in big cities in America. And now, thanks to a lot of people, particularly Dan Gilbert, the businessman who owns Quicken Loans and came downtown 7 or 8 years ago and proceeded to buy 100 properties and fix them up. Most of the empty or half-empty skyscrapers have been filled up with people. There's tremendous new vibrancy of the street. A lot of the street furniture and outdoor attractions and so on, food trucks and all that sort of stuff. Bicycle lanes are everywhere now. The Q line, the new streetcar system, is up and running. So I would think downtown, especially in special events, good weather, whatever, is just amazingly vibrant with people filling it up in a way that just wasn't happening. I also am a big fan of Eastern Market, the public market, the farmers market, which again, up to about 10 years ago, was really run down and declining. And it was spun off from direct control by City Hall into a private, nonprofit, but private corporation, professionally managed, financed with foundation grants and some city money. Still owned by the city, but now professionally managed, and it is completely turned around. And these huge market sheds have been renovated, and it's not only become one of the most vibrant farmers markets, public markets in the entire country. Very large, enormous site with thousands of people coming every Saturday. But they also the sheds there now are venues for special events, everything from fashion shows and car unveilings, new car model unveilings and weddings and book launches and everything else. And Eastern Market, I think, is not only the market sheds, but all the restaurants and wholesale food businesses and butcher shops and all that surround it. That whole venue is one of the most interesting areas in Detroit.
Yeah, I read your article that talked about the food accelerator there to help local food makers. Can you mention that a little bit?
Yeah, Eastern Market now has and is planning more in the nature of food accelerators, community kitchens where you can come and if you're a potential entrepreneur with a food business idea, you can come and use their community kitchen to do small batches, and you can sell it then from a table in the market. They also are planning bigger food accelerators where you will be able to not only use a community kitchen but also meet with other entrepreneurs and get some training, some hand-holding in what it means to run a business. And that's an important part of what we're doing now. And many of the food entrepreneurs in Detroit got their start from a table in Eastern Market on Saturday morning. And we now have, you can buy Detroit-made pickles and cheeses and coffees and chocolates and nuts and sausage and breads and baked goods and all kinds of things. Businesses that didn't even exist 10 years ago, are now flourishing, and they're all still at Eastern Market, and some of them are in, grocery stores in 14 states.
Wow!
So the food entrepreneurship is a major trend now.
See that, John? That's the real reason why I started United States of Grain, because I like to eat.
Right. Right. Well,
it's good excuse to get food and meet fun people.
We all do. We all do.
What's your favorite? Just a few like cafes or restaurants that are tapping into this local food economy, or breweries, distilleries.
Sure. Well, on sort of the high end of restaurants, there's a place called Selden Standard on Selden Street in Detroit, in Midtown, and that's been on some of the best restaurant of the year lists and that kind of stuff. Small plates. Very high end, really delicious food. More neighborhood level, a place called Craftwork over in the West Village area near where I live. Sort of a pub type atmosphere that's very nice. Old converted buildings, and then Supino's Pizza. Supino's Pizza is started only about 5, 6, 7 years ago, and immediately was rated the best pizza in Detroit. Very old school, very authentic Italian pizza, thin crust, great ingredients, best pizza crust in the city. And so Supino's Pizza is another wonderful place. That's in Eastern Market.
And any favorite beer makers or distillers that you like?
Well, the Michigan is fortunate to have a couple of really top-rate brewers, founders based in Grand Rapids, and Bell's Brewery based in Kalamazoo. They sell here. Founders has a brew pub or whatever they call it that's opening here in the city. There's a outfit called Hopcat, which is famous for their craft beers. It's a bar restaurant, and they're from Grand Rapids, but they opened one in Midtown that's extremely popular. So I think those are all good, and just the whole food scene here has gotten so much more interesting than it, even over the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. For me, from an outsider, it's hard to see the change that you're talking about, but you kind of notice it where you see these nice, beautiful buildings that look like they've been fairly renovated recently, and then not too far away is something like smaller and abandoned. So you can kind of see there's a little bit left from the old decline,
right.
But I do feel it, like there's something going on here.
Yeah.
Okay, any closing notes or thoughts about why everyone should come to Detroit, and just thoughts about Detroit, some closing thoughts?
Sure. Well, I think that Detroit, has a ways to go. We have not recovered. We are recovering, and but the notion that Detroit was sort of at the end of history, and it rose, it fell, and that's the end of things. That notion has been completely discredited. Detroit is reinventing itself, and it's on the way to being whatever it's going to be for the rest of the 21st century. And it's some combination of the old. The auto industry is still very important, but the entrepreneurs, the urban farmers, the remade streetscape with the waterfront and the bike lanes, the greening of the city in so many ways, that reinvention is well underway, and we're seeing it flourishing in places like downtown and midtown and Eastern Market and along the riverfront, and it's beginning to happen in some of the neighborhoods too. So I think Detroit really is reinventing itself very quickly, and that's what makes Detroit such an interesting place right now, because we are reinventing what it's going to be for the next 100 years.
What's like the one or two biggest hurdles to keeping this momentum going?
Well, there's still a lot of prejudice against Detroit out there in the minds of a lot of people, I think. Obviously, there's a lot of racial discord still, even now. White racism remains a problem. It's a majority black city. That's a big problem. Also, just in terms of nuts and bolts things, the real estate values are still relatively low in Detroit, although they've come up, and that means returns on investment are lower, and that holds things back. And then the capacity of the city to deal with things like licensing and building permits and inspections and all that. That used to be nowhere, and now it's improving, but it's still not smooth, well-functioning machine exactly. We still need to make more progress there. So a lot of those kind of nuts and bolts development type issues are still an issue. But I think compared to where Detroit was 10 years ago, I'm just astonished at how much progress has been made.
Great. John, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Can't thank you enough for your time and your insight and wisdom. And you're from New York originally, right?
I was born in New York City. My folks are both from, my dad's from Brooklyn, my mom's from Forest Hills. And we transferred around. My dad worked for General Motors, and we transferred around a lot. And I came here to Detroit 30 years ago to work for the Detroit Free Press, and
wow.
I'm still here.
Wow.
So I came here when the city was still well into its decline.
Wow.
And it was declining for many years. And so it's been a lot more fun to cover the city in recent years as things are picking up.
Well, thank you for staying here for so long and showing that arc historically with your writing and your coverage.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.